Welcome, everyone. Today, we're joined by Hanna Dijkstra from Earth Action, John Duncan from the World Wildlife Fund, Jodie Roussell from Nestle, and Stephen Jamieson from SAP to talk about plastics and the regulatory landscape. Thank you for joining us today. In the coming hour, we hope to share lots of useful information as to how businesses can prepare for the global era of plastics regulation. And throughout the webinar, we aim to have this really be a conversation with both our panelists and also participants. So please do make use of the Q&A function on this UMAP. You will find a bubble with a question mark labeled Q&A. Feel free to drop your questions in there. We will also answer through via text throughout the webinar and also verbally at the end take time to answer some of those questions. I am Irene Hofmeijer. I am your host today. And as I mentioned, the aim of the webinar is to debunk the data myths and provide insights on how companies can benefit in preparing ahead of emerging plastics regulation. We will be presenting the report that Earth Action co-published with SAP on shifting into gear, how businesses can prepare for the era of global plastics regulation. We're also pleased to be able to hold this webinar after yesterday's announcement that the next session of the UN Global Plastics Treaty will be held in Geneva from the 5th to 14th of August. And throughout the webinar, we will also be discussing how this could potentially set new expectations for businesses. So to kick us off, I will pass it over to Dr. Hanna Dijkstra, who will give us an overview of the regulatory landscape. Hanna, over to you.
Thanks, Irene. So let me just share my screen very quickly. I will be talking about the report that we just published. I hope many of you have had a time to look at it. If not, I think it's going to be shared in the chat. But as she mentioned, this report is titled Shift into Gear: How Businesses Can Prepare for the Era of Global Plastic Regulation. So initially, this report, we had in mind to look into the regulatory landscape leading up to INC. We were all very hopeful and optimistic that last year we would have a plastics treaty. That didn't happen, but we are still hopeful for this year. And while we were looking into the context, the background of the regulatory landscape and how that was sort of converging towards the treaty, we recognized that there was so much going on, so much to understand, so much to unpack, that there was enough to sort of write this report regardless of the treaty outcomes last year. And basically what we looked into was wider trends in the plastic landscape and discussing the impacts of those trends on businesses and providing recommendations and insights that hopefully can prepare businesses and have them understand what's going on in the plastic landscape. And what we found is that the regulatory landscape for plastic is very fragmented and it's constantly evolving. So things are changing very quickly. A lot of countries are trying to implement frameworks that are ambitious. Other countries are following suit. And there are a lot of also voluntary commitments and requirements from industry organizations, and also, of course, businesses have their own sustainability targets and ESG and CSR goals that they're trying to map. And this is creating quite an administrative and financial challenge for businesses. So we created this illustration as a way to sort of show visually the type of complicated, convoluted requirements that, for example, a sustainability manager working at a large corporation would be trying to juggle. So this looks like this is just one small slice of everything that's going on. But as you can see, there are quite different standards and there isn't always alignment. So for example, a company may be trying to understand how much recycled content they should be aiming for. They may see that for WWF's resource plastic, the target is 25%, whereas the Ellen MacArthur Foundation global commitment aims for 30%. And so also comparing that to internal targets, it might be challenging to understand what is actually ambitious, what is sort of the minimum requirement, And those are voluntary commitments. Those are sort of ambitions. But on the flip side, there's also sticks. So for example, if you look at the United Kingdom, they actually have a plastic tax on packaging with less than 30% content. So that's also an incentive or a disincentive, because the less recycled content you have, the more likely you're going to be charged with an actual bill for that at the end of the day. Looking at some of these other sort of complicated and aligned or unaligned targets, you can also look at disclosure. So a lot of these voluntary standards are asking companies to disclose the plastic production, usage, and recycling. And for companies operating in dozens or or over 100 countries, it's quite challenging to understand, where is plastic being produced, where is it being used, where does it ultimately end up, and what are the end-of-life pathways. There are other standards that are requesting companies report on their plastic footprint, but it's not always clear what actually goes into that footprint and how they can manage it with so many different supply chains and materials and products. And we've also seen something that's happened in the carbon space, which is that there are these ambitious voluntary targets, but those are often followed by mandatory requirements. So for example, CDP is a voluntary disclosure framework, but a lot of national regulations have sort of followed suit. So companies that are beginning to get their data requirements, their disclosure requirements organized and understood earlier, are then able to quickly adapt when different reporting requirements are put into legislation. So what we've also noticed, that there is an unfortunate lack of standardization in definitions, in different types of data requirements, in the compliance frameworks. And this actually increases a lot of the inefficiency and the administrative burden on sustainability managers. And they're dealing with this tangled web of different targets and requirements, which is also why a lot of brands and corporates are actually supporting an ambitious plastics treaty, because they see this as a North Star or a guiding framework that can really help spell out clear targets, clear definitions, have this alignment, and be able to sort of work towards targets in a more unified way. So looking specifically at extended producer responsibility, so this is the scheme where organizations or companies that are producing plastic or packaging pay into a fund that can then be used to fund downstream waste management and collection, because most of the time a brand that makes a product is not also involved in waste management. And EPR, the idea there is it closes the loop and it allows finances to be used for collection, recycling, and waste management. And EPR is happening all over the world, and it is rapidly expanding and strengthening. So EPR schemes exist in over 90 countries and states, and EPR is a really great program. However, it doesn't mean that there is an alignment or there is one EPR scheme. They're different in almost every single place they're being implemented, different definitions, different requirements, and that again can lead to quite a headache for large corporations operating under lots of different national jurisdictions. We also see trends in EPR. It's tending to expand and strengthen. So for example, textiles are now being considered for EPR schemes, which adds a different level of complexity. There are also other formulations, like in Indonesia, they've begun discussing extended stakeholder responsibility, so even widening the scope of who's considered responsible to pay into these schemes. And there's also a trend towards eco-modulation. And eco-modulation is an effort to move away from quantity to quality. So it's not just about the amount of plastic that's being used, but also, is that plastic that is more likely to be collected or recycled? And if so, then it would have a lower fee attached to it. So it's trying to encourage upstream changes in design for recyclability, using more eco-friendly products, going in that vein. But as you can imagine, as the eco-modulation takes place, so many different regulatory requirements happening, it can be quite complicated to figure out. And while we're sort of waiting for a treaty, which hopefully, if a treaty could also sort of codify some of this EPR processes, EPR systems and definitions, that would help a lot of this alignment. But in the meantime, there are companies and organizations that are also trying to support corporates. So for example, SAP has the responsible design and production tool. And the idea there is it can take all of the supply chain and production data, which they're really used to working with, and be able to line that up with the different EPR schemes in order to show companies where, first of all, to calculate how much they need to pay, and also show them where they can have real gains, not only in financial, but also in environmental benefits and reductions in some of this more problematic plastics, for example. So this is why at the end of this report, we really say, okay, we feel like we're at the dawn of this era of plastic regulation. And we hope that the treaty can only strengthen that and create this guiding framework, this unified guiding framework. And we also noticed in this report that the companies that are thinking about this, that are getting ahead, that are participating in these voluntary schemes, will actually be better prepared when mandatory regulation steps in and face less risks and ultimately less costs. So that's a brief intro to the report. There's tons more in there, so I do hope you read it. And now I'll pass it back to Irene. Thanks.
Thank you, Hanna, for painting this landscape. Indeed, it's quite a fragmented landscape, and I imagine it must be challenging, as you well mentioned, for sustainability managers to keep track of it all. So moving on to our next panelist, I'd like John Duncan, who leads WWF's No Plastics in Nature initiative, and has also been very active in the UN Global Plastics Treaty process. John, and Hanna mentioned that the treaty has the potential of being this North Star and setting the tone so that the fragmentation is addressed. What do you think? Why do you think the treaty is important for this business landscape that businesses need to operate in?
Yeah, thanks, Irene. I think obviously there are a lot of different elements here, but I think perhaps just to take a step back, it's not just important for business; it's important actually for solving the plastic pollution problem. I think what we've seen is that plastic pollution is a global problem, and because it's a global problem because it's a global commodity produced in one place, used in another place, and often kind of managed at its end of life in another location, all with different regulations and different ways of dealing with it, as Hanna's slide showed. So the idea that any one country can set up a regulatory framework which manages all of those different phases of its life is nonsensical in a sense. And if we want to try and manage it as a kind of the whole of the plastics life cycle, we need a global kind of approach to regulation. And that's why the treaty is so exciting, I think. It's, if you think about how much investment has gone into this space and this challenge of plastic pollution from both governments and business and philanthropies and all of these different groups over the last couple of decades, it's into the hundreds of billions of dollars, I guess, at this point in time. And yet, all of those investments have not made a blip on the kind of upward trajectory of plastic pollution leaking out into the environment, which really highlights why we need to kind of rethink the kind of plastics ecosystem and the economy more broadly. And that's what the treaty can do and is so exciting. I think the question about, how does this relate to business and why is it exciting for business is, as Hanna outlined, it's actually, companies are facing increased kind of challenges on plastic pollution, particularly companies whose brands are actually, sitting on these products that are landing up in the environment. And, if they want to do something about it, they recognize it's similar to kind of just a country-only approach. A company-only approach can't solve it. So they kind of needed to solve reputational risk and all of that, but there are actually, at base, it's also an economic opportunity to not have to try and develop a different product for each of these different economies. So I think there are lots of really good reasons for us having a treaty that works. And I think, maybe one last point, really important to emphasize, a lot of the discussions around the treaty are, what kind of a treaty do we want? Is any treaty kind of good enough? And I think the most important point here to highlight is that a treaty which results in individual countries being able to choose what kind of they're going to do about the plastic pollution problem is really not very different from the situation we sit in currently. So the kind of treaty that I think WWF and many others are arguing for is one which has these kind of global obligations where all countries and ultimately companies are going to be required to act in the same way to address this challenge.
Thanks, John. I think that's very helpful to understand I think what you painted about what's been done in the past and how it's brought us forward, but not far enough, and that the treaty really has the opportunity to consolidate all those efforts for global alignment. Could you very briefly also share what the current status of the negotiations are? You mentioned the need for an ambitious treaty, but how far away are we from that ambitious treaty, and what's the hope in August in Geneva?
Yeah, I mean, I think for those of you who've been part of the process, it's been a wild ride, and for some of you, it may feel like a long ride. The actual negotiations started in 2022, and we've had 5 different negotiating committee meetings. But by many standards, it's been a very quick process compared to many other international negotiation processes. So I think the fact that we didn't conclude at INC 5 is not necessarily unexpected. I think there are many states are still kind of getting to grips with what it means, how you would regulate plastic globally, and what are the kind of key elements. And I think it's really good to see that the kind of discussions are starting to hone in on where are those key topics. And we saw at INC 5, strong statements supported by almost 100 countries in some cases, coming forward saying that they understand the need for global rules around things like, the phase out of problematic plastics and chemicals of concern. Mexico was supported by 102 countries in their statement around the need to kind of reduce primary plastic polymers. And similarly, Rwanda made a statement supported by 84 countries about the need for global rules. So I think there's this, we've had a kind of a interesting process where we've had different versions of different papers being put forward up until this point in time, and most of the INCs being spent arguing about procedural elements, and kind of hasn't been that clear where we're going. But at the end of INC 5, when the dust is settled, I think it's quite clear that we've got probably a large majority of states making it clear that they support global rules on these key elements, and the kind of opponents are increasingly, I think, isolated, as it's becoming obvious that they don't want any form of treaty. So they're not really negotiating in good faith. And I think the question will be, how are the other countries, the ambitious kind of majority, going to deal with this? They're going to have to make some decision, probably, hopefully, at INC 5.2, but how to move this process forward in the face of this kind of continual opposition, which I don't think we're going to see being overcome by a consensus approach.
Good to hear there's still some optimism in your voice, John, and that there's hope for Geneva in August. I must say, having been in Busan in December, we didn't quite leave the room with hope, but indeed, like you said, that coalition of the willing does give us hope, and it's, I think, what we need to keep moving forward is that optimism to ensure that we reach those global rules in Geneva. So it's also important to highlight that WWF and EMF have been convening the Business Coalition for an Ambitious Plastics Treaty, bringing together over 275 companies that are calling for global rules. So with us today, we also have Jodie Roussell, who is the Public Affairs Lead at Nestle. Jodie, could you share with us why a company like Nestle is supporting the Business Coalition, and why these global rules are important for a company like yourselves?
Thanks very much, Irene. It all comes down to shared objectives and shared interest. I wholeheartedly agree with what John had shared. This is about changing a system. Sometimes there's a system for producing and managing plastic materials that needs to be fixed. Sometimes it's a system that needs to be built because it was never built. And these materials have a value in the economy, but they have no place in the environment. And so getting the right type of plastic pollution treaty in place is about building the system that we need so we can use plastic where we need it, and where it's not needed, we've already identified, along with the Business Coalition, areas for phase outs, for example, or for substitution. So I think it comes down to shared objectives. And if I highlight 4 major areas of work that attracted us to the Business Coalition, one of them is definitely the work we've been doing collectively in the policy working group on clear, consistent policy recommendations to be used toward the treaty that are based on the treaty text and are very much focused on the work that the negotiators are doing at any particular moment in time. And so supporters and members of the Business Coalition have the opportunity to be regularly updated and informed about the very technical progress that happens in the conversations, in the negotiation rounds, as well as in the select intersessional meetings. The second area of work of the Business Coalition is coordinating business advocacy efforts so that we can deliver these key messages about the value to business with a shared voice, as well as the areas where we may have convergence with NGOs and financial institutions. A third area is building confidence in the business community that an ambitious treaty can actually help us all. I think Hanna spoke to it with the compelling map she shared about the fragmented patchwork of regulation that exists today. This is a challenge for a large company like Nestle. It's also a challenge for middle-sized businesses that seek to trade across borders and encounter very different standards and requirements on whether it's, in the case of packaging, the packaging that they're using, or the standards for other materials. And lastly, the fourth objective, convening a diverse and inclusive group of companies, of supporting NGOs and associations, of business trade groups, the financial sector, so that we all have this unified vision of how are we going to support a treaty that can actually deliver a better business environment, a competitive business environment.
That's indeed, I think what you shared, Jodie, you also feel it in the room when you're with the Business Coalition, this unified ambition, this all wanting to move in the same direction, and perhaps also institutions that don't always sit in the same room. It's really a pleasure to be able to come together in those Business Coalition meetings and go and work together in this policy working group towards the negotiators. So thanks for highlighting those 4 areas of work. So policy, business advocacy effort, building the confidence, and this unified vision that the Business Coalition is working on. Moving more towards Nestle as a company, and you referenced the map that Hanna shared. This is part of your day-to-day navigating this complex regulatory landscape. And in our preparatory meeting, you also shared it's not just the environmental regulatory landscape, is that also plastics touches upon other types of regulation related to more social and human rights aspects. So it'd be interesting to hear from you. You know, how does a company currently have to navigate the regulatory landscape, considering that their regulation is already in place and we're not waiting for a treaty to take certain actions? So keen to hear from you. What is it that you're already doing today?
So, Irene, I would frame it largely as the shift from voluntary to mandatory compliance. Nestle's been very proactive for over a decade with our work on creating shared value to define ways to create environmental value, social value, economic value in the communities where our business is present and where our supply chains are present. We have made many voluntary commitments over the past years that we've worked toward, whether it's on responsible sourcing, and that may have environmental or social dimensions. And I think part of the challenge and the reason the treaty is so important is it can actually help us close some of the gaps of how those reporting requirements are very different. Again, Hanna showed a great illustrative slide of the type of 360-degree challenge that a sustainability manager in a company faces. And I think that illustration is quite accurate because many companies have both voluntary commitments and then mandatory compliance, such as extended producer responsibility regulation. We're tracking today 79 national systems, national jurisdictions around the world with EPR, 35 draft laws. There are dozens of countries with bans on certain materials. There are countries that have moved into eco-modulated EPR, where different fees are charged for different materials. And on a yearly basis, that can change the calculation around should a company be using material A or material B if they have equally high performance. All of these are considerations that companies need to take into consideration when they're planning as we see the shift happening from voluntary to mandatory. And today, depending on the year, it ranges from over 200 plus new regulations that are drafted, sometime at the subnational level, sometime at the national level. So there's a huge amount of compliance work for businesses. And I think that Looking forward, the opportunity the treaty provides is harmonizing many of those regulations so that the same rules apply. And with harmonized regulation, we can spend less time monitoring all of the rules that are changing and responding to them, and more time focusing on the impact that's actually intended by the rules.
Indeed. So I can imagine nowadays being a sustainability manager must feel more like a checkboxing exercise than actually being able to deploy initiatives and actions with this complex regulatory landscape. So helpful to hear from you directly, Jodie, the importance of alleviating reporting for compliance in order to leave space for developing programs that actually tackle the issue directly. So in that vein, SAP has been working in supporting businesses throughout the plastics supply chain with data management solutions. And part of what we look in our report is how data can help businesses meet their own targets and their regulatory requirements. So Stephen, who heads the sustainable product marketing at SAP, is with us. Could you explain to us some of these data myths and that are being debunked in the report? And what are the benefits for businesses in proactive data management?
Thank you, Irene, and thanks for the invitation today. So at SAP, we've been looking at this topic for the last 5 years or so, and I think there's some clear truths that emerge, particularly as we engage and work through the process of the business coalition and the treaty that we've seen over the last couple of years. And the fact is, we live in a data-driven world. The decisions we make, the decisions businesses make, are framed in good data. And the truth is that from a plastics and packaging perspective, the data story is incredibly fragmented. The set of definitions, the standards, the way we talk about packaging, we may as well be talking different languages most of the time. And what we've seen that's been so successful so far, at least in the process, is the way that the business community and the policymaking community have come together around this sort of common language of policy. And what we believe really is that we need to come together now in a common language of data in order to be able to embed this change and make it really actionable, both on the ground, but also in a global perspective as organizations sort of navigate this issue and this opportunity in the context of the wider sustainability paradigm. So I guess that's a little bit of the scene setting. What we see through the report are a set of myths, and actually what we see in the discussions that certainly we've had on the ground in places like Busan and Ottawa and elsewhere has been, firstly, this assumption that this expectation, this requirement for good data in order to be able to drive good policy, and it makes good sense. The myth is that somehow this data doesn't exist. Somehow this data needs to be created from scratch. The reality is so much of this data already exists. And so often it's simply a question of how to get access to that data and how to make it actionable in a given context. So the question is there, the answer is there. It's really a question of how we join those dots together. Then the second part is around the kind of expectation from industry perspective. We see a lot of assumption that data and that scope is really a problem or a preserve of one particular industry or another. Jodie's spoken from a food and beverage and a consumer goods perspective, but the data story is across industry. We work with 27 industries at SAP across this landscape. And so having that breadth of focus and being able to bring that context from that supply chain into the story here is so critical. One topic that comes out strongly is the idea that regulations themselves create inefficiencies. And the truth is, it's the lack of harmonization that's creating the inefficiency. As we can see in so many good examples around the world, the more that we can find this conformity, the more we can speak this common language, the quicker we can get onto business for business sake and compete upon the things that actually drive good business value and stakeholder value, rather than talking about different packaging standards or different plastics data standards. We see a lot of talk about how risky data sharing is. There's a lot of people who think that just because we're sharing the definition of a certain piece of packaging, that's somehow going to be a data protection issue. Firstly, we're not talking consumer data here, but secondly, from a very practical level, there's such benefit in having this data shared, and I think most participants in the supply chain see much greater value in data sharing than they do in keeping that closed. And then from I guess the broader context perspective, and something I've been looking at a lot recently, is the bigger picture from a regulatory standpoint. We talk a lot about the plastics regulations, but clearly they only work in the context of a wider regulatory picture. Most people managing packaging are looking at both the EPR context, but also that within the broader framework, perhaps of PPWR in Europe. If you're in Europe, you might also be looking at things like the deforestation regulations for paper and packaging and pulp. You might be looking at, or you will be looking at CSRD, given the changes with the recent omnibus in recent days. So this broader context of regulatory impact also needs to be taken into consideration, and it's that broader context that's the opportunity. That's the opportunity for us to get this data right now, and for us to not wait for the treaty to be perfected and landed in any way possible. The need to have this data is here and now. The opportunity to repurpose that data across multiple different contexts for multiple uses is ever present. And so that's really our focus: how to drive this down to a common process, common data model, and then how we unlock the opportunity for AI to then support us on that journey. By being able to focus on that, organize in that way, allows us to really unlock those opportunities and accelerate the journey, accelerate the impact for business, and accelerate the impact of policy and the quality of policy in terms of driving the change.
Thanks, Stephen. Sorry. Thanks, Stephen. I think it's interesting how you highlight the fact that sometimes we create these limits as to data as this big thing that we can't touch and that it's highly confidential and that it's not available. But what you're explaining is that really the data is there. It's about how do we get it organized and how do we analyze it so that it is fit for purpose in the reporting that's requirement. Could you spoke about the potential, and are there already solutions out there that can help in managing the data that is available for the different reporting requirements that are needed? And from your experience, have you ever seen this being done? You mentioned also that the different industries, right, by different actors of the plastics value chain.
But absolutely, by all means. It won't surprise you to know that within SAP we have a suite of solutions and supporting sustainability action in general. And again, the focus there is around how to organize a predictable set of processes that enable a measured response to the changing face of regulations and not react to every regulatory update. It's around how we organize around a central data definition and standard that can be used across for global purposes, and enabling the opportunity for AI. And within that scope, we brought into market a couple of years ago SAP Responsible Design and Production, which has been co-innovated by members of the Business Coalition, really to focus on how we can support this global context in the context of the local EPR challenge, and really providing CFOs that grip on overall EPR exposure, understanding the challenge that beats to the margin in the business, and then how to ultimately innovate and design new solutions that allow you to deliver both from a perspective of meeting the intent of the regulation, but also delivering profitable business. We're being very realistic in the world we're in. We have to be able to demonstrate that growth agenda in the context of delivering upon that sustainability mandate and that solution to the plastics challenge in this context. So it's bringing together those elements. And in terms of the world of CPG companies that are cooperating and building in this direction, there are obviously too many to mention. A number that stand out. One particular is around Henkel, who've used it very effectively in Spain with the Spanish plastic tax, expanding across multiple markets now at a global level. And a number of others as well. So I'm sure the team will happily share more details on that in follow-up.
Thank you, Stephen. So thank you also to all our panelists for your interventions. From Hanna, we heard this overall landscape, the fragmentation. From John, the moment in time that we are to be able to, how do we say, get the highest return on our existing investment in solutions to plastic pollution by this treaty that can set the North Star. From Jodie, the need for ease in reporting so that attention can be focused on action, and the fact that business is also calling for regulation through the Business Coalition, who is asking for global rules to level the playing field. And from Stephen, the fact that the data is there, that data management solutions are also there in order to facilitate ease of reporting. So we now have a nice amount of time to take questions from our participants. So I think we have our first one from Axel in the chat, which was specific to the EPR map. Hanna, would you be able to speak a bit further to that question on, could you define the scope of EPR represented on your map? Is it SUPs or packaging?
Definitely. So in that EPR assessment, we were really doing a broad analysis of where EPR was. So we don't have a very specific product or packaging type that we were looking into. I'm sure Jodie has more awareness of exactly where different EPR schemes are applying to different products. But in that, it was just a general EPR scheme that was in existence. So in some cases, that was just packaging. In others, it was broader and included other types of single-use packaging or textiles, for example. But broadly, it would be a sort of, if you're thinking about a consumer goods company that wanted to, for example, create a new product that was wrapped in packaging, they would be confronted with almost every single country that we had on that map. So I think, yeah, it's not super specific in that map that we created. But definitely a sustainability manager would be forced to sort of do the digging to understand which of those countries or jurisdictions would apply to them. Since I have the mic, do you mind if I ask a question?
Go for it.
Okay, so when listening to the different speakers, I think what I was really thinking about is it's almost like compliance and regulation has turned into, I think Irene called it like this checkbox. So it's really like trying to get your ducks in a row, trying to understand how to disclose and report. And of course, the ultimate goal of all of these systems or all of these regulations is to actually create change and system change and innovation. And so it's not just about compliance, it's about being able to go the next step. So I'm curious if Jodie or the other panelists have ideas of how the treaty can be defined in such a way to actually encourage this innovation and R&D and system change, and not just get stuck with, here's another checklist that we all have to then sort of reshuffle our systems to align with.
Hanna, maybe I can respond with how I see it in terms of a bit of a reframe, because it's not so much of a checklist, but I would draw an analogy to how IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standard, launched, which was back in the 80s. In the beginning, there were only like 9 countries that agreed to use the same standard, but you have to ask, well, why? It was actually because they couldn't compare businesses' financial results because different metrics were being used, different reporting methodologies. There were different sets of information were being used to describe company financial performance. It was actually a barrier to investment. Over time, almost every country in the world now uses IFRS as a standard. So it's actually quite easy to compare companies' performance results. If you look at the challenge, and I look at the question number 3 on EPR in the Q&A, which was asking, for example, how can businesses collaborate with suppliers to ensure compliance? it's not just about checking a box. The original intent of the founder of EPR was actually to force material shift and to require companies to think about their production processes differently, whether that be today areas that extended producer responsibility applies to. In some cases, it's textiles, in others, it's tires, in others, it's consumer goods packaging, electronics. Consumer electronics are another area where EPR is also quite common. And the intent of EPR was actually to force greater efficiency in the system, but also to drive a circular economy, so that the materials typically that have lower EPR rates are the ones that have the highest value in the secondary market. So it's really about creating an engine to drive a circular economy, and at the same time, one that can be micro-adjusted on an annual basis with the rates to align pretty well with the national waste management strategy or national material strategy. So I think it's less about just checking the box, but it's more about checking the box as part of it, but it's about creating the system and creating a system that can actually deliver the type of economic performance and framing that we want, that can drive the innovation that you're talking about. If that answers your question.
Thanks, Jodie. I think it does. And I see that John also has his hand up. So John, over to you as to how that systems creation can be enabled by the treaty.
Thanks. I think what I was also going to say is that, I mean, we're talking a lot about EPR, but policy unlocks a lot, can unlock a lot of things. So policy certainty on things like reuse, for example. If you say, look, every company has to put X amount of its, portfolio into reusable, this specific type of reuse, or they have to collaborate with all the other companies to make sure you're using the same washable system, then that's a massive opportunity waiting to happen. So you talk about like new businesses, and even just take recycling, recognizing that we need to do a lot more than recycling. We can unlock a much more value from the recycling system right now if we can get rid of the things that are contaminating the recycling system at the moment. And that's where the kind of ideas of eliminating problematic materials and harmonizing product design are going towards. Like, okay, let's just try and make sure that the stuff that we are putting on the market actually can possibly be recycled. And then, you could double, I don't know what the exact rates are, but, there are lots of reports talking about this, but we could, massively increase the amount that we can recycle, creating massive business opportunities for everyone across the value chain, in a sense, to take advantage of. So that, and then there's, there's alternative materials, which also come with a lot of potential pitfalls. If you're not doing them right, they're not responsibly sourced, and they're not actually improving the situation. There's some challenges around that. But again, good policy can actually help unlock and incentivize investment in these new areas. So I think, there's a massive amount of opportunity, that a kind of a level playing field, which is actually aligned, also with the financial sector. So finance knows where to put its money in order to drive the change that we want to see, creating like actually, in commercially investable opportunities, which at the moment, often recycling even is sitting at that, 1 month it's viable, and the next month it's not, because of some of the kind of the challenges that it's facing. We could really do a lot to change that with a good harmonized policy environment.
Indeed, I think that's very true. Is about also creating the right incentives, right? So when we talk about policy, it's quick to think about how you're going to be penalized, but it's also about creating the system that incentivizes good behavior. And that's the big opportunity that we're at now, is that how to create that global system that incentivizes the right behavior, or at least the behavior that could enable shifting away from a system that generates a lot of plastic pollution, but that actually enhances the solution. So as you mentioned, John, the alternatives and also the strengthening of the recycled content that's available in the market in order to have a true circular economy. I see that we have a couple questions that relate back to this conversation around EPR. So maybe I'll merge the two questions, the last one from Piotr and Axel together. to the panelists that are familiar. So perhaps Jodie, this is going to also end on you, but just in general, or also John and Stephen, and Hanna, of course, if you have things to add. But one question is about, what are the do's and don'ts of EPRs that you've seen around the world? Like, what are the good practices, the best practices? And looking into the question of eco-modulation, what are the common principles that we should have for eco-modulation? Whoever wants to jump in first. I see Jodie has her mic off, so over to you, Jodie.
So in terms of the question in the chat, we really like the Belgian model, and I'll explain why. In addition to it being eco-modulated at quite a detailed level, there's also a very good pre-communication to all the companies active in the market about 18 months in advance in terms of pricing. And so companies know well in advance what the EPR rates will be in 12 months. And so that's actually very helpful when you're seeking to do planning. I think a couple other best practices would be for EPR design that there's one producer responsibility organization who serves as the system operator, and they have a monopoly on system administration. That annually updated fee table that I mentioned with per kilo fees that actually cover the cost of collection and sorting and the trading operation to take baled materials and trade them to recyclers. Close coordination with the national government waste management strategy is quite important. Some type of nationally appropriate enforcement mechanism. How reward and punishment happens is culturally dependent. So it's important that that's sorted out at a national level. And in countries where there's a high population of informal sector workers, we also think it's quite important that the incentive return systems might exist to compensate collection work by the informal sector. What does this mean? It could mean that there are depots operating. Instead of deposit return, where a deposit is put on a material before it's placed on the market, and then the consumer pays that deposit, instead there can be depots that simply pay per kilo of material covered. And it's important that those rates are calibrated as well to work with the producer responsibility groups need to actually have reasonable prices that cover living income or living wage levels, depending on the structure of employment in the market. So that collection and sorting can be covered and it can be done in a fair way. And I'll make a final comment, Irene, on the last question in the Q&A, or sorry, second to last, on supply chain compliance, because the participant had asked, how can businesses collaborate with suppliers to ensure compliance? In most EPR systems, it's the producer or the importer of record that's responsible. So in the case of Nestle, if we produce in a country that has EPR and we're then selling the product that we manufactured onto the market, we would be paying the EPR fees. If that product is then taken and exported by a distributor into a third country where we have no operations, that distributor would then be carrying the responsibility to file with the PRO and to pay those EPR fees.
Thank you, Jodie. Do any of the other panelists want to share any insights they might have into EPR systems? And I see you have your mic off. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a little about EPR. So I think there's lots of policy analysis you can do on different EPR schemes and how effective they are. But I also think I remember visiting Sweden for the first time, visiting my cousin, and how much separation they have at the source. When you take your trash in Sweden, you have, I think there was like 10 different trash bins, and everyone's really good about separating it. And I think that's something that's often left out of in this conversation. And when we want a system change, we need everyone. We need consumers, we need citizens, we need everyone. And what I appreciated about that kind of system is, one, it really helps the efficiency because you have very well sorted waste, which can then be better managed at the end of its life. But also it sort of had this empowering feeling as an individual that I was participating in making this system more effective. And in the Netherlands here, we've actually gone backwards in that, where there's less waste separation. And I think a lot of our waste is not actually getting recycled. And I think having those elements where there really is the behavior change component and awareness raising, I think EPR schemes have the opportunity there. And similarly with deposit refund. So also having the system where a consumer can get paid if they bring their bottle back to a recycling machine or recycling depot. So really thinking about it from a systems perspective, I think also can improve the effectiveness and buy-in from multiple stakeholders.
Thanks, Hannah. I think we've covered maybe not all the questions explicitly, but I hope that we've given a degree of answer to the various questions on EPR in the chat and the Q&A. I'll take the fact we have a few minutes left for the last question that's been asked and merge it with one on the Q&A, which we partly answered on the systems change potential of a treaty. So there's one question in the Q&A that asks about what are the potential opportunities and benefits from regulation. I think we partly addressed that. And in the chat, we have a question on how high are the barriers to evolve to reusables versus recyclables. So I'm going to kind of merge it together and pose a question, the last question to our panel, which is how can also the treaty enable this transition when we look about the type of packaging? So moving from the single-use environment to a reusable environment, what are the opportunities that something like the treaty can unlock, and what are the potential benefits? I know, John, we did some work with you and I know WWF has quite some work done on reuse systems in general. What are also the potential system benefits of reuse systems if we are to operate them at scale? So I'm putting you very much on the spot here, which I hope is okay. But yes, I think there's a number of synergies that if reuse is implemented in the right way could not just be a cost to business, but also an opportunity in cost reduction. So giving you a little bits of info for you to build your answer on.
Sure. Okay. I'll do my best. I think, one of the things in the reuse space, if we're going to take that example, has been really challenging. We've seen so many pilots, companies and projects, come and sadly go in the reuse space because, trying to solve reuse at the individual company level is very, very difficult. And I think all the kind of growing body of evidence shows that, we need to do this at a systems level. And then when you do it at a systems level, you can really, you can have a massively decreased kind of environmental footprint. And then, as any business knows, once you start to actually be able to do something at scale, the costs will also come down. So I think there's a lot of opportunity on both the environmental and the costs front. I give the example of containers for reuse. It's one of those things where all around the world, almost all containers are the same on the ones that you transport stuff in on ships. They may have different functions. Some might be refrigerated and all of that, but they're pretty much all the same size. And there's a reason for that, because it fits nicely on ships, and then when the ship offloads it and puts it on a truck, it fits nicely on the truck. And trucks are pretty much the same size all over the world. So there's examples of this kind of harmonization that has happened. We've got so many examples of why it is more beneficial to have those systems in place. And the treaty is that opportunity for us to actually not try and wait till we have kind of evolution slowly takes place over hundreds of years to get us to that kind of conformity, but actually we can sit in a room and hopefully over a very short period of time align on these kinds of things. So reuse, all the reports show that there are massive opportunities, but we will not unlock them unless we do it at scale, with everyone being required to buy into one system. I think kind of Jodie was talking about the EPR equivalent, having one kind of PRO. It's the same thing with reuse. We need to all do it at the same kind of agree on the same principles and metrics and processes. I think you'll find that that similar analogy works for many other areas of innovation as well. Looking at alternative materials or alternative logistics approaches, all of those things, there are kind of environmental and business opportunities associated with them.
Thank you, John. I'll leave a last opportunity for any of the panelists if they would like to give a closing word or reaction on the reuse question. Jodie, go for it.
Sure, Irene. And I'm not able to respond to everyone in the chat, but I had shared just briefly, because we're reaching time. We at Nestle had shared our view on the enabling conditions in terms of what it takes for reuse to be able to be scaled up. and the type of systems regulation that John was speaking to that we think is necessary. So if you'd like, you're welcome to share the link that I had posted, which leads to an interview that we did on what do we think needs to be done in terms of enabling conditions. Just high level, it's legislation at the international or national level, decarbonization of logistics systems, supporting investments to modify industrial infrastructure, taking a new look at competition laws, standards, and retro planning, so that we actually have time for supply chains to shift. But happy for you to share that with the audience if you like.
Amazing. Thanks, Jodie. Excellent. So I think considering we're close to the end, to have some final wrapping comments from my end. Really, I just want to thank again all the panelists for the time today. I hope also for the participants, it was enriching conversation. What we were hoping to communicate across with this webinar is really the fact that we are at a moment of time where there's this opportunity of reaching a plastics treaty. Business is standing behind it. We see this from all the businesses active in the business coalition, active in asking for harmonized regulation that can level the playing field. So as a business, there is an opportunity to take action now, taking action both internally in getting your data systems organized and managed to facilitate reporting, and also in taking action by joining the business coalition, being active and asking for global rules and a leveled playing field in the space of the UN Global Plastics Treaty. Really our message is that proactive compliance can be a competitive advantage for business. And there's an advantage in the potential of reducing risks and enhancing sustainability performance and strengthening also companies' market position. So we hope that you all enjoyed our conversation today. Again, we invite you to review the report we co-authored with SAP, where you can learn also about the technology tools that SAP has that facilitates this data management. And thanks again for joining us, and wishing everyone a great continuation to their day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Irene.